Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about the situation on the ground. The Russians, according to information we have for the first day in a row, are bombing an attack in the city of Zaporizhzhia. So something is happening right now in this direction, because during the previous night we got additional report from pro-Russian sources that the Russians managed to improve their positions between the village of Nestyryanka and the village of Nova Andreevka. So summarizing everything, the Russians managed to move further in the western direction, and as a result of clashes, the Russians established control over some stronghold in this territory. Furthermore, the sources reported that the Russians resumed their attempts to move further on the line between Rabotina and Novodanilovka. So as for me, I was expecting that the Russians would attack a little bit further in the western direction between the villages and the city of town of Vasilievka and the town of Stepnogor. So I expected this attack, but according to information we received, the Russians began offensive exactly on this line. Now let's move further and let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. First, let's talk about the village of Vuhledar. For the second day in a row, we are receiving updates about additional progress of the armed force of Russian Federation. Today we have reports from different mappers, and according to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to improve their line to the west of Staromayorsk, and this is very important because this is not something like significant progress on the ground. This is not like huge progress or breakthrough of Ukrainian defense, but this is just an attempt to maintain the line of combat contact, and the most important, this is an attempt to concentrate forces along this line, the line between the village of Staromayorsk and the northern part of Priutina. Most likely, as soon as Vuhledar falls, and Vuhledar is going to fall very soon, as soon as the Russians reach the outskirts of Novoukrayinka and Bogoyavlenka, the Russians will begin full-scale offensive operation on the line between Priutina and Zelenopolye and between the villages of Staromayorsk and Vremivka, with the purpose to restore control over this territory, and the most important, to take under control the main supply roads that Ukrainians can use to support their forces in the South Donetsk direction and around the town of Gulyai-Polye. Now let's talk about the most important direction, the battle for Vuhledar. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces between the village of Novoukrayinka and Prichistovka. Currently, it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians are planning to begin full-scale offensive operation in this direction today, tomorrow. Obviously, this is going to happen within the next few weeks, but maybe not now. If we change updates for previous days, we see some activity. We see that, for example, starting on the 26th of September, we got FPV drone attacks, then we have artillery strikes and FAB strikes, then a few more FPV drone attacks, and then another artillery strike. So the Russians have a significant focus exactly in this part, so they're preparing something. As for the western flank of Vuhledar offensive, we have additional reports from neutral mappers that the Russians, as a result of attack, as a result of number of offensive operations in this direction, managed to improve their positions and to get closer to the village of Katerinovka from the south and from the southeast. Currently, the distance between possible Russian edge positions and farms of the village of Katerinovka is less than 1 kilometer. So most likely the Russians will try to cross Balka-Saloninka and to take under control this territory with the purpose to begin offensive and storm operation of Katerinovka. Now let's talk about Vuhledar itself, and we receive significant number of updates, including changes on the ground. Let's talk about changes. According to neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to secure the territory between the village of Pavlovka and the village of Mykolaiv. We're talking about this part, and the Russians managed to improve logistics by taking under control tree lines between Mykolaiv and Vuhledar itself. As for the city of Vuhledar, we have additional changes on the ground in the northern part. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the southern direction, in the central direction, in the western direction, and in the northern direction. Significant progress of the armed force of Russian Federation, as you can see, and the most important, currently the Russians control around 40% of the citadel. So we have updates that are coming from pro-Russian sources, and we have updates that are coming from neutral sources. Furthermore, the Russians began securing the tree lines that goes from Vuhledar in the northern direction. For example, in this video we can see how the Russian flamethrower drone was attacking the Ukrainian positions along these tree lines. They were trying to clear this territory and then to enter this territory by themselves. Currently, we don't know exactly what is the result of this operation, but obviously the Ukrainians, after this heavy fire, was forced to fall back further in the northern direction. As for Vuhledar itself, we start receiving significant updates that if by the end of the week there will still be at least a part of Ukraine garrison there, it will be a real miracle. This post was published by pro-Ukrainian sources who are related to the situation on the ground. Furthermore, we start receiving updates from pro-Russian sources that Ukrainians began operation not to escape the encirclement, but the Ukrainians began operation to evacuate and to break through the encirclement, not to escape, but already to begin the breakthrough operation with the purpose to save as many as possible soldiers of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. And we start receiving first updates of these attempts. For example, in this video we can see Ukrainian tank that was running away from Vuhledar. You know that Vuhledar is very small and very complex city, but there are lots of underground facilities there where the Ukrainians were keeping and holding vehicles, especially T-64. And for example, in this video we can see that Ukrainians began using the armored T-64 tanks with the purpose to evacuate as many as possible and evacuate those who can be evacuated. But for example, this T-64 was destroyed exactly in this point, so we can say that for the crew of this tank, the day was successful because they managed to break through the encirclement. The Russians are bombing and attacking the main supply roads. For example, in this video we can see multiple launch rocket strike with the multiple launch rocket strikes system, and the Russians were bombing the main evacuation roads from the city of Vuhledar and from the village of Bogayavlenka. So obviously we can start counting days. This progress on the ground was discovered, was reported somewhere at the beginning of the 26th of September, somewhere at 1-2 a.m. Most likely during the next 24 hours, the Russians will finish the battle for the stronghold, and the offensive operation will be turned into a securing and clearing operation when the Russians will destroy additional and several islands of resistance between the buildings and the basements. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction. According to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of Ukrainsk and to take under control the tree lines and the positions along the railways. So this is additional progress of the armored force of Russian Federation, according to different mappers. Just a small improvements, the Russians managed to secure the territory and the Russians reached the operational space. Now let's talk about the original Pokrovsk and Mirnograd area. As you can see, we have a lot of icons in this part, and during the previous night we got significant number of updates from different sources, from pro-Russian sources, from neutral resources, and of course from pro-Ukrainian resources that the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to establish complete control over the villages of Krutoy Yar, Krasny Yar, and the Russians established control over Nikolaevka. Obviously significant progress, but as for geolocations, we have one, and the geolocation is coming from this stronghold. In this video we can see destroyed Ukrainian tank, and this tank was attacked by the Russian grenade launcher that was located further in the western direction. So we will turn back on map and we will discuss where was the position of Ukrainian tank and where was the position of Russian grenade launcher. Anyway, this video confirms that the stronghold to the north of Nikolaevka was completely captured and secured by the Russians. And by the way, in this video we can see the shape of the stronghold we are talking about. So now let's talk about the map. The Russian soldier was located exactly in this point, and Ukrainian vehicle BMP or something like that, like this, was located in this point. And from this area the Russians attack Ukraine BMP with grenade launcher system, which confirms complete control over this stronghold. So we don't know for sure, and we still haven't received anything that can confirm Russian control over Krutoy Yar, Krasny Yar, and Nikolaevka as well. But obviously the Russians are trying, if the Russians don't have control over this territory, obviously the Russians are trying to move along this line with the purpose to take or to encircle the Ukrainians in this salient and to create another cauldron. Let's talk about this road. So today we have a video from this part which confirms edge Russian positions in this stronghold. If you remember yesterday, the day before yesterday, we got the video from this point. We see the movements of Russian stormtroopers. When the Ukrainians discovered them, the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the Russian forces in this point. And then a few days before this video, we got additional video from Grodovka, from the village of Grodovka. And for example, in this video we can see attempt from Ukrainian side to counterattack the Russian forces. A bit earlier we have additional video of how the Russians were moving in the western part of Grodovka. So based on all these geolocations we received since the beginning of the 17th of September, so for the previous week, the Russian roads of movement was something like this. And now we see Russian control over this stronghold, and now we see that the Russians are about to encircle the Ukrainians in this part. Telling the truth, I'm not sure that the Russians have control over this area. We keep these areas contested down due to different changes of reliable sources, but once again I believe that the Russians are trying to encircle the Ukrainians by moving further in the western direction, and the main purpose of the Russians is to take under control the next stronghold to the west. And if the Russians can do this, then they create a cauldron between the northern part of the city of Novogrodovka and this stronghold. So this is exactly what the Russians are planning to do, and most likely they are going to complete this within the next few days. Now let's return back to the 26th of September and let's continue. As for the Donetsk agglomeration, there are very heavy clashes in this dense network of the fortifications. During the previous few days, the Russians managed to improve their positions according to different mappers and to take under control 2 strongholds. The Ukrainians still control around 10 strongholds, a little bit to the west and the northwest, and now there are very heavy clashes exactly for this territory. The Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russians. They brought additional reinforcements and reserves with the purpose to stabilize the area, but the Russians brought additional FPV drone operators groups, and the Russians began bombing and attacking and FPV droning the Ukrainians in this area. And we remember the simple rule: if we see drones, then most likely we can see the movements in the same direction. So this number of geolocations confirms that most likely the Russians are about to resume their attempts to attack further in the direction of Sukhaya Balka. And if the Russians are able to do this, this is going to be a very big problem for the Ukrainians, because the Russians will reach operational space. And as you can see, between the village of Sukhaya Balka, Valentinovka and Konstantinovka itself, there are no more strongholds or fortifications made by the Ukrainians. The Russians most likely will be able to move very fast further in the north and in the northwestern directions. Now let's move further and let's talk about Siversk. There are very heavy clashes in this area, and the Russians continue bombing and attacking the stronghold in Verkhnyokamyanskaya. So probably this is the strongest point of defense of the armored forces of Ukraine in this direction. Almost every single day we receive another video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory, and you know that we can compare the Verkhnyokamyansk with the village of Prichistovka. The Russians have been bombing the village of Prichistovka for probably 2-3 months before they began full-scale offensive. And if you remember, the resistance of Ukrainians in Prichistovka was broken just within 1 day of clashes, and now the Russians are doing the same. They're trying to break the resistance and the spirit and will of fightings of Ukrainians in the same village, in the village of Verkhnyokamyansk, and as soon as they do this, they will begin their own full scale in the direction of Siversk, but not today, not tomorrow, no, obviously not in September months. Now let's move further. The Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit to the west of Makeivka, just a small gains according to different mappers. Now let's talk about northern Kupiansk direction. The flower of Peshchanik continue blooming, but without any changes on the ground. The most important videos are coming from Kupiansk. The Russians are bombing the city of Kupiansk heavily. Today we got another video of how the Russians destroyed another temporary point of armored forces of Ukraine with FABs. And if when talking about the Kupiansk itself, we can compare that almost every single video we're receiving another FAB video of how the Russians were destroying either bridge or another warehouse or another temporary point, temporary deployment point. So the situation in this city is very difficult for the armored forces of Ukraine. Volchansk, the Russians continue retreating from the southern, from the northern part, further in the direction of the border. And while the Russians are retreating, the Russian artillery forces try to support the withdrawing forces with very heavy fire. In this video we can see several FAB attacks, FAB strikes, tower strikes on possible Ukrainian positions. The main purpose of these attacks in this desert, in this Volchansk desert, is just to slow down the Ukrainians and not to allow them to attack the Russians in their back while the Russians are retreating. So this is the situation, and a significant number of strikes, very heavy explosions. Most likely the Russians are not planning to return back to Volchansk. Most likely they will try to find another solution how to move in the Kharkiv direction, or maybe maybe the Russians are planning or want the Ukrainians to take these positions, to leave their strongholds, to enter this open space, and maybe the Russians will destroy them and then the Russians will return back. But maybe this is just speculation. As for the Kursk direction, there are very heavy clashes in this area, and the main updates, as you can see, are coming from the Glushkova territory. After the beginning of Russian counter-offensive operation, for the previous few days, the Russians managed to restore almost every single bridge in this area. Of course, they haven't repaired them completely. They managed to create some constructions that allow the Russians to redeploy additional reinforcements and reserves from the south to the north, from the north to the south as well. So, as you can see, currently there are no problems for Russians to have a proper level of support for their forces in this part. And this is another problem for the Ukrainians, because the goals and the objective of Ukraine offensive is become completely impossible to achieve due to significant Russian superiority in this area. Furthermore, we have additional updates from Russia, from Moscow. Today, yesterday Vladimir Putin announced the changes in Russian nuclear doctrine. Very important document, very important statements. Everything was changed, everything was clarified, and now the Russians are saying that if NATO countries or European countries or anybody attack Belarus, this will be considered as attack on the territory of Russian Federation. The next thing, if anybody who doesn't have nuclear weapon attack territory of Russian Federation, and this country and this state is supported by the country with the nuclear weapon, Russia will consider this attack as a attack of both these two countries, the country who has nuclear weapon and the country who doesn't have nuclear weapon. Furthermore, the Russians are saying if they manage to discover, as a result of intelligence or work of air defense, a significant number of drones or missiles that are heading towards the territory of Russian Federation, this can be considered as a reason to begin using nuclear weapon against the country that's where all these missiles were launched in drones were launched on the territory of Russian Federation. So lots of clarifications, but the most important thing I believe is coming about Belarus. Now Russia gave complete guarantees to Belarus. If anybody attacked the territory of Belarus, Russia will use nuclear weapon immediately. And you know that since the beginning of September, we got significant number of updates from Belarus, from the president, that, for example, on this 18th of September, an attack on Belarus is the Third World War, Lukashenko said. The Belarusians expect a serious escalation of the Ukrainian conflict in September, October, and a possible location for this escalation is Belarus. So once again, something big might happen on the territory of Belarus, and probably the Russians gave certain guarantees to Belarus. If somebody attacks, and if these guarantees is real, that means that Belarus can begin their own operations, probably also on the territory of Ukraine, without being afraid of attack in their back from the Baltic states or from Poland. Now let's talk about the UN. Currently there is a meetings, lots of very important event in UN and in Organization of United Nations, and a lot of leaders, almost every single person, let's say from leaders of different countries, made their own statements. But let's discuss the most important. Well, while talking, during Zelensky speech, Zelensky accused China and Brazil from the UN rostrum of preparing to invade other countries because they do not support his peace formula. You know that I haven't seen anybody in the world since the beginning of the 21st century who've been humiliating China, Brazil and India so much as Zelensky have been doing for the previous few months. He's very upset with the position of China and Brazil, and the most important, he's very upset that China adopted sanctions and export control for FPV drones, and Ukraine were buying a lot of drones in China during the previous stage of the special military operation. Obviously now Ukrainians will have and suffer significant problems. On the other hand, Brazil will present a Chinese-Brazilian peace plan for Ukraine to the global south countries by the end of week, reports Reuters. It is expected that at the meeting, which will take place on September 27th in New York, Colombia, Colombia, Egypt, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates and other global south countries will participate. Representatives of Europe countries were not invited to the meeting. This is very important. We see that the world is splitting in two. Furthermore, we have additional reports about the Chinese and Russian relations that they're as strong as never been before, and this is the situation. So as I understand, Zelensky haven't managed to achieve anything he was expecting about his peace plan, but still there were no meeting between Zelensky and Biden. The meeting is going to take place within the next probably few hours, and then we will understand everything. But we have already received report that the United States of America will provide Zelensky additional military package for around $6 billion. $8 billion. The United States plans to announce more than $8 billion worth of military assistance for Ukraine on Thursday during Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visit to Washington, and this is also very important. The last package was around 61 billion, and the package has already ended, and now this is the last package of Biden in his president term, and probably Zelensky will be forced to use this package until January, when another president will come to his power. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.